Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection staring back at you isn't the person you remember being 5 years ago. The eyes are the same. The face bears familiar features, yet something fundamental has shifted. The person in the mirror has done things that would have horrified your younger self, things that once seemed impossible, unthinkable, morally reprehensible. But here's the terrifying part. You can justify every single one of those actions. In fact, you believe they were necessary. You believe they were right. This isn't a hypothetical nightmare. This is the daily reality of Hwang In-ho, better known as the front man from Squid Game. And if you think his story is just fiction, if you believe you could never become what he became, then you're about to discover something deeply unsettling about human nature and about yourself. Picture this moment. A police detective, sworn to protect and serve, discovers that his missing brother, the very person he's been desperately searching for, is not just alive, but has become the architect of mass murder. The same hands that once upheld justice now orchestrate death games for entertainment. The same mind that once sought to save lives now calculates the most efficient ways to end them. How does a protector become a predator? How does a brother become a killer? But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. In-ho doesn't see himself as a monster. He doesn't wake up each morning wrestling with guilt or shame. He has convinced himself that what he's doing is not just acceptable, but righteous. He has transformed his moral framework so completely that genocide becomes charity, murder becomes mercy, and betrayal becomes love. You might be thinking, that could never be me. I would never lose myself like that. But consider this. Every morning, millions of people wake up and participate in systems they know cause suffering. They buy products made by exploited workers. They support institutions that perpetuate inequality. They remain silent when speaking up could save lives. And they sleep peacefully at night because they've learned to rationalize these choices as just the way things are, or necessary for survival. The distance between you and the front man might be smaller than you think. What makes In-ho's transformation so chilling isn't that he became evil, it's that he became evil while maintaining his capacity for love. Watch the way he looks at his brother Junho during their final confrontation. There's no coldness there, no psychopathic emptiness. There's genuine affection, real pain, authentic sorrow. He kills the person he loves most, not despite his humanity, but because of it. He believes he's protecting Junho from a worse fate. He believes he's being merciful. This is where the true horror lies. In-ho isn't a sociopath who lacks empathy. He's a human being who has learned to weaponize his empathy in service of a corrupt system. His love has become indistinguishable from his cruelty. His protection has become indistinguishable from his betrayal. Think about the implications of this. If someone with the capacity for deep love can become a mass murderer while maintaining that love, then what does that say about the nature of evil? What does it say about the systems we build and the roles we play within them? What does it say about the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions? The front man's mask isn't just hiding his identity from others. It's hiding his identity from himself. Every time he puts on that geometric face, he's choosing to become someone else. Someone who can do the things Hwang In-ho could never do. But here's the paradox. The more he wears the mask, the more it becomes his true face. The performance becomes reality. The role becomes the person. You wear masks too. We all do. Professional masks, social masks, family masks. And each time you put one on, you risk losing a piece of who you think you really are. Each compromise, each rationalization, each moment when you choose convenience over conscience, these are the building blocks of transformation. Not the dramatic, obvious kind we see in movies, but the quiet, invisible kind that happens one decision at a time. The question isn't whether you could become the front man. The question is, what masks are you already wearing, and how much of yourself have you already lost beneath them? This is the great paradox of human nature that Squid Game forces us to confront. The same psychological mechanisms that allow us to love, to hope, to survive in a harsh world are the exact same mechanisms that can transform us into monsters. Our greatest strength, our ability to adapt, to rationalize, to find meaning in suffering, is also our greatest vulnerability. And if you think you're immune to this transformation, if you believe your moral compass is too strong to be corrupted, then you've already taken the first step down in harm's path. Because the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who know they're monsters. They're the ones who are absolutely convinced they're the heroes of their own story. The front man's tragedy isn't that he became evil, it's that he became evil while remaining human. And that possibility, that terrifying, inescapable possibility, lives inside all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. To understand how In-ho became the frontman, you need to understand something that most people refuse to acknowledge. Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It arrives wearing the mask of necessity, speaking the language of duty, and carrying the banner of the greater good. It seduces us not through our vices, but through our virtues. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the depths of human consciousness, called this phenomenon the shadow, the part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the darkness we project onto others while remaining blind to our own capacity for harm. Jung observed something that should terrify you: the people most convinced of their own goodness are often the ones most capable of committing atrocities. Why? Because they've never learned to recognize their own shadow. They've never accepted that they too are capable of monstrous acts. In-ho's transformation didn't happen overnight. It began the moment he first entered the games as a player, watching innocent people die while he fought for survival. That experience planted a seed, a tiny crack in his moral foundation. But here's what makes his story so psychologically complex. That crack didn't fill with hatred or sadism. It filled with something far more dangerous: understanding. He began to see the games not as senseless cruelty, but as a system with its own twisted logic. The players chose to be there. They were given fair warning. The rules applied equally to everyone. In his mind, the games became a pure expression of human nature, revealing who people really were when everything was stripped away. And once you start seeing mass murder as revelation rather than atrocity, you've already lost yourself. This is what philosophers call moral relativism, the idea that ethical truths are not absolute but depend on context, culture, and circumstances. It sounds academic and harmless until you realize its practical implications. Once you accept that morality is flexible, that there are no universal truths about right and wrong, then any action can be justified given the right framework. Genocide becomes population control. Torture becomes necessary intelligence gathering. Murder becomes mercy. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who declared that God is dead, warned about this exact phenomenon. He predicted that once humanity abandoned absolute moral standards, we would face what he called the abyss, a complete breakdown of meaning and value. But Nietzsche also observed something crucial: humans cannot live without meaning. When we lose our old sources of purpose, we don't simply give up, we create new ones. And these new meanings, born from desperation rather than wisdom, often become more destructive than what came before. In-ho created his own meaning. He transformed himself from victim to administrator, not out of sadistic pleasure, but out of a desperate need to make sense of his trauma. The games weren't meaningless violence. They were a necessary process of selection, revealing the strong and weeding out the weak. He wasn't a murderer. He was a curator of human potential. He wasn't betraying his values. He was evolving beyond naive morality to embrace harsh truth. This psychological phenomenon has a name: moral disengagement. Albert Bandura, the renowned psychologist, identified the mental mechanisms people use to commit harmful acts while maintaining their self-image as good people. These mechanisms include euphemistic labeling, calling murder elimination, advantageous comparison, comparing games to worse forms of death, and moral justification, claiming the games serve a higher purpose. But In-ho's case reveals something even more disturbing than simple moral disengagement. He didn't just rationalize his actions, he transformed his entire identity to align with them. This is what Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, called tragic optimism, the human capacity to find meaning even in the most horrific circumstances. Frankl observed this as a source of resilience and hope, but In-ho's story reveals its dark potential. When meaning-making goes wrong, it can transform victims into perpetrators while convincing them they're heroes. Consider the psychological pressure In-ho faced after winning the games. He had survived by watching others die. He carried the weight of that survival, what psychologists call survivor's guilt. Most people would be crushed by such an experience, but In-ho found a way to transform his guilt into purpose. He convinced himself that his survival meant something, that he had been chosen for a greater role. The games weren't random violence, they were a test, and he had passed. This is where Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy of existentialism becomes crucial to understanding In-ho's transformation. Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free, forced to create meaning and define themselves through their choices. There is no predetermined purpose, no inherent nature, no divine plan. We are what we choose to become. For most people, this freedom is liberating. For In-ho, it became a curse. When you accept that you are entirely responsible for creating your own meaning, and when that creation happens in the context of extreme trauma, the results can be catastrophic. In-ho chose to see himself as someone special, someone selected by fate to administer these games. He created a narrative where his survival wasn't luck or chance, it was destiny. And once you believe you're destined for something, once you see yourself as chosen, then any action in service of that destiny becomes not just acceptable, but mandatory. The most terrifying aspect of In-ho's psyche is it in his cruelty toward strangers. It's his tenderness toward his brother. This reveals the ultimate perversion of his moral framework. He has learned to see love and murder as compatible acts. He kills Junho not despite loving him, but because he loves him. In his twisted logic, death is preferable to the disillusionment his brother would face if he learned the truth about the world. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The way ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities, not through malice or sadism, but through thoughtlessness, conformity, and the inability to think critically about their actions. In-ho isn't evil because he enjoys causing pain. He's evil because he has stopped questioning the system he serves. He has become what Arthur Schopenhauer called a willing servant of the will, someone who has surrendered their individual moral judgment to a larger impersonal force. And here's the most disturbing realization of all. The psychological mechanisms that transformed In-ho into the front man aren't unique to him. They're universal human tendencies, present in everyone. The capacity for moral disengagement, the need to create meaning from trauma, the tendency to see ourselves as special or chosen. These are normal psychological processes. Under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, any of us could follow the same path. The question isn't whether you have these tendencies. The question is whether you're aware of them and what you're doing to guard against them. But here's what makes In-ho's story truly haunting. His transformation doesn't just affect him. It ripples outward, creating a web of consequences that touch every life in his orbit. And this is where the real horror begins, because the same invisible forces that corrupted him are working on you right now, reshaping your reality in ways you don't even notice. Think about how In-ho's psychological evolution affects his relationship with his brother. Junho, the detective, represents everything In-ho used to be: idealistic, justice-seeking, convinced that truth matters more than comfort. But instead of inspiring In-ho to remember his former self, Junho's presence becomes a threat to the carefully constructed narrative that allows In-ho to function. The brother he loves becomes the person he must destroy, not out of hatred but out of psychological necessity. This reveals a terrifying truth about human psychology. Once we've committed to a particular worldview, especially one that justifies harmful actions, we don't just defend it against external threats, we defend it against our own better angel. The part of In-ho that might have been saved by his brother's love becomes the part that must eliminate his brother's influence. Love becomes a liability. Conscience becomes an enemy. This psychological phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance, creates what Leon Festinger called belief perseverance, the tendency to maintain beliefs even when confronted with contradictory evidence. But In-ho's case reveals something more sinister: the way cognitive dissonance can transform love into violence. His affection for Junho doesn't weaken his commitment to the games, it strengthens it. Because if he's wrong about the games, then he's not just a murderer, he's a murderer who destroyed his own brother. The psychological cost of that realization is too high to bear. So instead of questioning his beliefs, he doubles down on them. He doesn't just kill Junho, he kills him lovingly, tenderly, convinced that he's saving his brother from a worse fate. This is the ultimate perversion of human emotion, the transformation of protective instincts into destructive ones. Now consider how this applies to your own life. Every day, you make choices that shape not just your own reality, but the reality of everyone around you. When you choose convenience over conscience, when you prioritize your comfort over others' well-being, when you rationalize small compromises as necessary pragmatism, you're not just changing yourself, you're changing the world. The neurological basis for this transformation lies in what scientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on experience. Every time you make a choice that goes against your stated values, you literally rewire your neural pathway. The first compromise feels uncomfortable, even painful. The second feels slightly easier. By the 10th, it feels natural. By the 100th, it feels inevitable. In-ho's brain didn't suddenly switch from protector to predator. It gradually rewired itself through thousands of small choices, each one slightly easier than the last. First, he chose survival over sacrifice. Then he chose comfort over courage. Then he chose power over principle. Each choice carved new pathways in his neural network, making the next choice feel more natural, more justified, more necessary. But here's the truly insidious part. This neuroplasticity doesn't just affect your conscious decisions. It affects your unconscious perception of reality. As your brain rewires itself to accommodate your choices, you begin to see the world differently. What once seemed wrong starts to seem neutral. What once seemed neutral starts to seem right. What once seemed right starts to seem naive. This is why In-ho genuinely believes he's protecting Junho when he kills him. His brain has rewired itself to see murder as mercy, betrayal as love, destruction as salvation. He's not lying or pretending. He's experiencing a fundamentally different reality than the one he inhabited before his transformation. The cultural implications of this are staggering. We live in societies built on the assumption that people share basic moral intuitions, that we can distinguish between right and wrong, that we value human life, that we prefer truth to comfortable lies. But In-ho's story reveals how fragile these shared assumptions really are. Under the right pressures, with the right incentives, entire populations can rewire themselves to accept atrocities as necessities. This isn't theoretical. History is filled with examples of ordinary people who participated in genocide, slavery, and systematic oppression while maintaining their self-image as good, moral individuals. They didn't suddenly become monsters. They gradually adapted their moral frameworks to accommodate monstrous action. They experienced what psychologists call moral drift, the slow erosion of ethical standards through repeated small compromises. Consider the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students were randomly assigned to play guards or prisoners in a simulated jail. Within days, the guards began exhibiting genuinely sadistic behavior toward the prisoners. They weren't naturally cruel people. They were normal individuals whose behavior was shaped by their environment and role expectations. The experiment had to be terminated early because the psychological transformation was happening too quickly and too completely. In-ho's story is the Stanford prison experiment extended over years, instead of days. He didn't just play the role of administrator. He became the administrator. The mask didn't just hide his face. It became his face. The performance didn't just convince others. It convinced himself. This psychological malleability extends beyond individual behavior to collective beliefs. When societies normalize harmful practices, they don't just change laws or policies. They change the neurological patterns of their citizens. People don't just comply with unjust systems. They internalize them. They don't just tolerate cruelty. They learn to see it as kindness. And here's the most frightening realization. You're surrounded by these systems right now. You participate in them daily. You've likely already begun the same process of neural rewiring that transformed In-ho from protector to predator. The only difference is that your transformation is happening so gradually, so imperceptibly, that you don't notice it. Think about the last time you witnessed injustice and chose to remain silent. Remember how uncomfortable that choice felt initially? Now think about how that same choice would feel today. Has it become easier, more automatic, more justified in your mind? If so, then you've experienced the same neuroplasticity that enabled In-ho's transformation. The mask you wear isn't made of geometric shapes and metallic surfaces. It's made of rationalizations and justifications, of small compromises and pragmatic choices. And just like In-ho's mask, it's slowly becoming your face. The question isn't whether this process is happening to you, it's how far it's already progressed, and whether you still have the power to stop it. Because once the transformation is complete, once the neural pathways have been fully rewired, once the mask has become the face, there's no mirror left to show you who you used to be. There's only the person you've become, convinced that they're exactly who they've always been, certain that their choices are not just right but righteous. And that certainty, that absolute conviction in your own moral superiority, is exactly what makes you dangerous. But here's where In-ho's story takes an unexpected turn, and where your story can diverge from his, because buried within his tragedy lies the blueprint for a different kind of transformation, one that leads not to corruption, but to genuine awakening. The same psychological mechanisms that can turn protectors into predators can also turn sleepwalkers into revolutionaries. The key lies in understanding a radical truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You're not who you think you are. The person you call yourself is largely a collection of unconscious habits, inherited beliefs, and socially conditioned responses. Most of what you consider your authentic self is actually a performance you've been rehearsing so long that you've forgotten it's an act. In-ho's fatal mistake wasn't that he changed, it was that he refused to acknowledge he was changing. He told himself he was the same person with the same values, just adapting to new circumstances. This self-deception is what made his transformation so complete and so dangerous. He never questioned whether his new identity aligned with his deeper truth, because he never admitted he had developed a new identity at all. The path to freedom begins with what Socrates called the foundation of wisdom. Know thyself. But this isn't the shallow self-knowledge of personality tests and self-help books. This is the terrifying, exhilarating recognition that you are a stranger to yourself, that the person you've been is largely unconscious, and the person you could become is entirely up to you. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wielded absolute power, yet spent his private moments questioning his own motives and actions. In his personal journal, later published as Meditations, he wrote, "Be like the rocky headland on which the waves constantly break. It stands firm, and round it, the seething waters are laid to rest." Aurelius understood something that In-ho never grasped. The greatest enemy is not external opposition, but internal corruption. The most important battle is not against others, but against the unconscious forces within yourself. Aurelius practiced what philosophers call negative visualization, deliberately imagining losing everything he valued, not out of pessimism, but out of psychological preparation. By regularly confronting the possibility of loss, disgrace, and death, he inoculated himself against the kind of desperate meaning-making that consumed In-ho. He remained psychologically flexible because he never allowed himself to become too attached to any particular identity or role. This practice reveals a counterintuitive truth. The people most resistant to corruption are not those with the strongest beliefs, but those with the deepest capacity for self-doubt. In-ho's transformation was enabled by his certainty, his conviction that he understood the nature of reality and his place within it. Liberation requires the opposite, the courage to embrace uncertainty, to question your most fundamental assumptions, to remain psychologically homeless rather than settling in a comfortable delusion. Viktor Frankl, drawing from his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, discovered something remarkable about human resilience. The prisoners who survived weren't necessarily the physically strongest or most optimistic. They were the ones who maintained what he called tragic optimism, the ability to find meaning even in meaningless suffering, while refusing to let their circumstances define their identity. They understood that while they couldn't control what happened to them, they could control how they responded to what happened to them. But here's the crucial difference between Frankl's survivors and In-ho. The survivors used their trauma to expand their compassion, while In-ho used his trauma to justify his cruelty. Both found meaning in their suffering, but their meanings led to radically different outcomes. This reveals something essential about the process of transformation. It's not enough to create meaning from adversity. You must choose the right kind of meaning. The right kind of meaning has certain characteristics. It increases rather than decreases your capacity for empathy. It expands rather than contracts your definition of who deserves moral consideration. It makes you more rather than less willing to question your own assumptions. It connects you more deeply to your humanity rather than allowing you to transcend it. In-ho created meaning that did the opposite of all these things. He used his suffering to justify a worldview that eliminated empathy, contracted his moral circle to include only those who served his purposes, made him certain of his own righteousness, and allowed him to see himself as beyond ordinary human concern. This is how you can tell the difference between genuine wisdom and sophisticated self-deception. Wisdom makes you more human, while self-deception makes you less human. The rebellion against this kind of psychological corruption requires what the ancient Greeks called metanoia, a fundamental change of mind and heart. It's not enough to change your behavior or even your beliefs. You must change the process by which you form belief. You must become suspicious of your own certainty, curious about your own blindness, humble about your own wisdom.
This is why the most psychologically free people in history have often been those who embraced what Zen Buddhism calls beginner's mind, the attitude of openness, eagerness, and lack of preconceptions that comes naturally to beginners but is difficult to maintain as expertise develops. They understood that the moment you become certain you understand something completely is the moment you stop learning about it and start distorting it to fit your preconceptions. The practical application of this philosophy requires what might seem like contradictory actions. You must become simultaneously more decisive and more doubtful, more committed to your values and more willing to question them, more confident in your judgments and more aware of their limitations. This isn't psychological confusion, it's psychological sophistication. In-ho lost this sophistication the moment he decided he understood the true nature of reality. He stopped questioning, stopped learning, stopped growing. He became psychologically static, frozen in a worldview that justified his actions while protecting him from their consequences. The rebellion against this static state requires constant movement, constant questioning, constant willingness to be wrong about things you're certain you're right about. But here's the most radical part of this rebellion. It's not enough to save yourself. The psychological forces that corrupted In-ho are systemic, cultural, collective. They can't be defeated through individual enlightenment alone. They require what the philosopher Cornel West calls a love ethic, a commitment to creating conditions that make psychological freedom possible for everyone, not just those with the privilege, education, or circumstances to achieve it independently. This means recognizing that your liberation is connected to everyone else's liberation. It means understanding that the systems that enable people like In-ho to emerge and thrive are the same systems that limit your own psychological freedom. It means accepting that true rebellion isn't about escaping the world, it's about transforming it. The question is no longer whether you can avoid becoming like In-ho. The question is whether you can become the kind of person who makes it impossible for others to follow his path. Can you create relationships, communities, and institutions that nurture psychological freedom rather than psychological corruption? Can you become a force for humanization rather than dehumanization? Because the ultimate tragedy isn't that In-ho became a monster. It's that he became a monster in a world that needed him to become a hero. And that same world is looking at you right now, waiting to see which path you'll choose. Here's the truth that will change everything you thought you knew about In-ho, about evil, about yourself, and about the nature of human transformation. The front man isn't the villain of Squid Game. He's the mirror. Every horror you feel watching his actions, every revulsion you experience witnessing his choices, every moment of moral superiority you feel comparing yourself to him, these aren't responses to his otherness. They're responses to your recognition. Deep in your unconscious mind, In the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime trying to ignore, you know that you contain the same capacity for transformation that consumed him. This is why his story haunts you. This is why you can't simply dismiss him as a psychopath or sociopath. This is why his gentle moments with his brother feel more disturbing than his acts of violence. Because you recognize something fundamentally human in his corruption. Something that whispers uncomfortable truths about your own potential for moral compromise. But here's where the story transcends tragedy and enters the realm of revelation. In-ho's transformation wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. Not in one dramatic moment of decision, but through thousands of small choices that accumulated over time. And if transformation can happen in one direction, it can happen in the other. The same psychological plasticity that enabled his corruption can enable your liberation. The ultimate realization isn't that you could become like In-ho, it's that you already are like In-ho and you always have been. The only difference is degree, not every rationalization you've made for harmful behavior, every compromise you've justified in the name of necessity, every moment you've chosen comfort over courage. These are the same psychological processes that transformed a protector into a predator. Consider this. In-ho didn't wake up one morning and decide to become evil. He woke up one morning and decided to survive. Then he decided to adapt. Then he decided to find meaning in his adaptation. Then he decided to protect that meaning. Then he decided to expand that meaning. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each choice appeared to be the only viable option given the circumstances. This is the most terrifying truth about human nature. Evil doesn't announce itself as evil. It presents itself as necessity, as pragmatism, as the mature response to harsh realities. It convinces you that you're not compromising your values. You're evolving beyond naive idealism to embrace difficult truths. It transforms vice into virtue so gradually that you never notice the transition. But here's the miraculous flip side of this realization. If corruption can masquerade as wisdom, then wisdom can masquerade as corruption. If small compromises can lead to profound degradation, then small acts of integrity can lead to profound transformation. If you can become unconsciously evil, then you can become consciously good. The difference lies not in your capacity for darkness, everyone has that, but in your willingness to acknowledge it. In-ho's fatal flaw wasn't that he had a shadow. It was that he projected his shadow onto others while maintaining the illusion of his own righteousness. He saw the players as weak, desperate, and morally compromised, never recognizing that these were perfect descriptions of himself. Jung called this process shadow integration, the conscious recognition and acceptance of your own capacity for darkness. It's not about indulging your worst impulses or excusing harmful behavior. It's about ending the exhausting psychological work of maintaining the illusion that you're fundamentally different from people like In-ho. It's about accepting that you contain the same raw material for both heroism and villainy. This acceptance is paradoxically liberating. When you stop pretending that you're naturally good, you can start choosing to become actually good. When you stop assuming that you're immune to corruption, you can start building systems to protect yourself from corruption. When you stop believing that you're inherently different from monsters, you can start doing the conscious work necessary to become genuinely human. The ancient Greeks understood this principle through their concept of hubris, the arrogant pride that leads to downfall. Every tragic hero in Greek drama falls, not because they're evil, but because they believe they're beyond the forces that corrupt ordinary mortals. They think they're special, chosen, immune to the psychological laws that govern everyone else. Their conviction of their own righteousness becomes the source of their destruction. In-ho's story is a modern Greek tragedy. His hubris wasn't believing he was superior to other people. It was believing he was superior to his own psychology. He thought he could transcend human nature through understanding it. He thought he could manipulate others without being manipulated himself. He thought he could wear masks without having those masks reshape his fate. The ultimate wisdom is the recognition that you cannot transcend human nature. You can only choose which aspects of human nature to cultivate and which to resist. You cannot escape the forces that shaped In-ho. You can only decide how to respond to them. You cannot avoid the psychological pressures that transform protectors into predators. You can only develop the awareness necessary to recognize when those pressures are operating on you. This is why the most psychologically free people in history have often been those who understood their own capacity for unfreedom. They remained vigilant not because they were paranoid, but because they were realistic. They questioned not just their actions, but their motivations. Not just their beliefs, but their reasons for holding those beliefs. Not just their choices, but their process for making choices. The final, most powerful realization is this: you are not condemned to repeat In-ho's pattern, but you are condemned to face the same psychological forces that created his pattern. How you respond to those forces will determine not just who you become, but what kind of world you create for others to become themselves. In-ho's greatest tragedy isn't that he became a monster. It's that he had the potential to become a hero and chose unconsciousness instead of awareness, certainty instead of curiosity, comfort instead of growth. He had the same choice you have right now, in this moment, as you finish reading these words and prepare to re-enter a world that will test every insight you've gained. The front man's mask is coming off. The question isn't what face lies beneath it. The question is what face you'll choose to wear. Because in the end, we are all wearing masks. The only choice is whether we'll let those masks become our faces, or whether we'll have the courage to keep removing them, again and again, for the rest of our lives. The game isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. And unlike In-ho's games, this one has no predetermined rules, no fixed outcomes, no inevitable winners or losers. There's only the eternal choice between consciousness and unconsciousness, between love and fear, between becoming more human or becoming something else entirely. Choose wisely. The person you become depends on it. The world you create depends on it. And somewhere in the depths of possibility, a different version of In-ho, one who chose awareness over unconsciousness, is watching to see if you'll learn from his tragedy or repeat it. The mask is in your hands now. What will you do with it?